Violent protests and police brutality in the state of Georgia continue as pro-Russian government tries to secure its unquestioned rule. Russian influence vanishes from Syria as their agents and military command vanish from Syria too. Fleeing Assad army, rebel offensive, and increased violence after years of ceasefire. Remember to like, share and subscribe as we really appreciate your support to the channel. These topics and more we will discuss today. And let's start with the flammable departure of Assad regime and Russia from Aleppo in Syria. The war in Syria has started a wave of migration from the Middle East to Europe 13 years ago. That same migration problem has since haunted entire countries, with masses of people fleeing from the war-torn country of Syria. And how many politicians have been elected while using populism against the migrant problem, or the other side, we don't know and won't be able to count. And now, after a fairly long ceasefire on the region, it is again on the fire. Russia carried out a series of airstrikes in Syria on Sunday as rebels advanced after seizing Aleppo, according to the UK-based Syrian Observatory for Human Rights. Warplanes also struck rural parts of Idlib and Hama, where the group leading to rebel offensive was recently taken control, it added. The Syrian government has meanwhile lost control of Aleppo itself for the first time since the country's civil war began. The surprise offensive by opposition forces, which began on Wednesday, marks the most significant strike against Russian-backed Assad regime. Russian aviation played a significant role in keeping the Assad rule in the war-torn Syria back then. But since 2016, the country has been divided between different factions that include Assad-controlled parts, American-supported Kurds, Islamic State territories, and Turkey-backed Syrian opposition forces. The strike against Assad is a strike against Russia. Just look at this clip and you will understand everything. And the main trigger of the war in Syria is Assad regime, according to a military expert and an IDF reserve officer, Igal Levin. The fact that Assad family is Alawite Muslims and not Sunni denomination means a lot, as it is more important which religious denomination you are than rather your nationality in the Middle East. And each faction has its own interest in the country. Some want to build an independent Kurdish state, some want to build a caliphate. But everybody hates Bashar al-Assad.
In Syria, the main population consists of Sunni Muslims. Alawites, there are literally around 1 to 2%, something like that. Well, not many, to put it simply, less than 5%. And essentially, the clans consisting of this minority. In the Middle East, religious denomination is generally more significant than national identity, meaning the region is mainly divided along religious lines. For example, in Lebanon, people tend to live separately, with Christians, Shiites, Sunnis, and so on, each in their own areas. Syria is no exception. And therefore, the Assad regime is the trigger, meaning if we look at any forces there, from radical ISIS terrorists to the moderate Syrian opposition, they all share one thing in common. They are all against the Assad regime.
And while these actions unfold in Syria that are more pleasant to Turkey and the USA, aka the NATO bloc, and not so pleasant for Russian and Iranian-backed Assad, there are signs that this tendency will continue, as the main forces of the Russian army are already involved in Ukraine, and there's no Wagner to come to the aid against well-trained and well-motivated Syrian rebels. And continuing the theme today, I'd like to discuss a very personal topic for myself and for many people who remember color revolutions in the states of Eastern Europe. Protests continue to rage in Georgia for the fourth day after a pro-Russian government has announced suspension of the Euro-integration path of the country. It strongly reminds me of the Maidan revolution in Ukraine in 2014, when police brutality rushed upon the protesters and students after President Yanukovych decided to suspend the Euro-integration of Ukraine. After the suspicious elections, where a pro-Russian party unexpectedly, or not, secured a majority in the parliament, the Prime Minister Kabachidze tried to change the president of the country to a pro-Russian one too. He even suspended the national election to include only Georgian Dream representatives in the Special Electoral Commission to choose a new president. After that, Kabachidze announces that the country will not continue its Euro-integration process until 2028. And that was it. People rushed to the streets, setting the parliament building on fire, as well as a boogeyman of the prime minister. The United States have announced suspension of their strategic partnership with Georgia on that same day, and the opposition party leader Zurab Jarapidze was arrested during the protests while leaving the demonstration. Police actively used water guns, and the protesters and the people started throwing Molotovs at police units. Just watch at this footage. The resilience and invincibility of this Georgian girl has impressed me very much and impacted me, reminded of the old memories of 2014. Tensions intensified in late October when Georgian Dream claimed victory in the contested election that was widely seen as a referendum on joining the EU. Georgia, which gained independence from the Soviet Union in 1991, as well as Ukraine, has for years pursued EU membership, as well as Ukraine, with the goal of joining the bloc written into its constitution, just like here in Ukraine. The Georgian Dream governing bloc accused the EU of using the prospect of accession talks to blackmail Georgia and to organize a revolution in the country, end of quote. The government's move brought thousands of pro-European Georgians to the streets of the capital, Tbilisi, where they are rallied for consecutive nights despite a violent police backslash. Reuters videos show protesters waving Georgian and EU flags, with Ukrainian symbolic sometimes, and chanting Russian slaves at police officers guarding the parliament building. Police fired water cannons and tear gas at protesters, while men wearing balaclavas were seen running into the crowds and beating individuals. The protests have spread beyond the capital, with Georgian media reporting demonstrations in at least 8 cities and towns as now, according to Reuters. Revolution spreads like fire when the government is about to make an alliance with Russia. About both these topics and one more, we will talk with Mr. Peter Dickinson, an expert of the Atlantic Council and publisher of Business Ukraine magazine. Greetings, Mr. Dickinson.
Good evening.
Well, it is really good to see you again in our studio, again with me. And I'd like to ask you about the Syrian front, and why the rebel attack is usually called an attack on Russia, on the Assad regime, which is backed by Russian and Iranian forces. How this proxy front affects the balance of powers between these big players?
Well, I think what we're seeing in Syria now is a symptom of a wider shift geopolitically. The Iranians, in particular, are very overstretched now. Their proxy forces in Lebanon, Hezbollah, have been devastated of late. Iran itself has received a number of very serious blows from the Israelis and has been exposed domestically. So I think Iran is in a very weakened position and is in no state to intervene on behalf of the Assad regime. Now, the same may be true for Russia. Certainly, Russia is very heavily committed militarily to its invasion of Ukraine. Putin has sent the vast majority of his military assets, his army, his troops, and also aviation to Ukraine. He's using them now to pursue his goals in Ukraine, and therefore is also less able to offer the Assad regime the support it needs to quell this rebellion. So I think what we're seeing now is very much an opportunistic strike by rebel forces in Syria. They understand that now they have an opportunity to attack Assad, that Assad is essentially propped up by his foreign supporters, by his foreign benefactors, and he has very little power or strength of his own. So with both Iran and Russia heavily committed elsewhere and weakened, this is a very, very dangerous moment for Assad, and the rebel forces are looking to capitalize. And as we can see from the very striking progress they've made in the past week, it's clear that they've timed their attack perhaps to perfection.
And several factions are advancing against Assad at the same time. Those are US supported Kurdistan forces and different factions backed by Turkey. Can we say in this situation that NATO, in the face of these forces that are backed by Turkey and the United States, that NATO is taking over in the Syrian war?
No, I think that would be a very wild exaggeration. I don't think that the West is directly involved, as directly involved as that would imply. Certainly, Syria has long been a geopolitical chessboard, and all the major powers there have had an influence. I'm sure that they are again involved in what we're seeing now. But I think fundamentally, what we're seeing here is the Syrian opposition forces taking taking advantage of very fortuitous for them geopolitical circumstances. Again, the weakening of Russia and Iran. I think that they are now seizing that moment, and they are receiving some support from their international backers. But I wouldn't compare this to some kind of a proxy war or to a direct Western involvement. I think that these parties are offering support at most, and it's certainly not a major theatre for them.
And just for our viewers, I'd like to remind that in the Middle East, sometimes religious denomination means far more than nationality. And Iran is the Shia Muslim denomination, with Assad regime being the Alawite denomination, and the rebels are being the Sunni Muslims, which are majority in the world, and also I believe that Turkey is of the Sunni denomination too. So we have here like a religious clash more inside Syria itself right now.
Well, religion has always played a role in the uprising, but essentially it is an uprising against the rule of Assad and the government that he has installed. And opposition is driven primarily by the brutality of his regime, the brutal way in which it initially, the whole Syrian war began as a popular uprising against the government of Assad and the brutality of that regime during the Arab Spring. The Assad regime responded to those political protests, a social movement, essentially a protest movement, with very harsh, with a very harsh crackdown, which then escalated into military conflict. And then we had the different factions emerging in a very complex picture involving tribal, ethnic, and religious divides, and a wide range of different interest groups emerging, fighting often against each other as well as against the regime. So it's an extremely complex picture we're seeing here. But I think if we want to make sense of what we're seeing specifically in the last week, the key factor here is the weakening of Russia and Iran, and the fact that the Iranians and the Kremlin are not currently in a position to prop up the Assad regime as they have been for the last 7 or 8 years. That is very telling, and that's why we're suddenly seeing a dynamic on the battlefield that has been absent for ever since the Russian intervention began in 2015.
And talking about the political losses of Russia, the Kremlin, and Iranians, the so-called Euromaidan in Georgia. It reminds me of the Euromaidan in Ukraine in 2014, violent protests against the government that decided to copy-paste the path of Viktor Yanukovych in his refusal to Euro-integrate and to stay close with Russia.
Yes, the parallels with Ukraine's revolutions, I would say both of Ukraine's post-Soviet revolutions, the 2014 Euromaidan revolution and the 2004 Orange Revolution. I think the parallels are obvious, are immediately apparent. They are visually similar. The causes are similar. And again, we see the classic Russian model of the Kremlin overplaying its hand, being overly assertive, being overly aggressive, and trying to push a population toward a rejection of integration with the West and to embrace reintegration into the Kremlin's authoritarian model, the kind of informal empire that Vladimir Putin is looking to establish throughout the former realms of the Russian Empire. Now, Putin again and again has overplayed his hand in this regard and has provoked a violent response. He did so in Ukraine to a degree in 2004 to provoke the Orange Revolution, and then very noticeably, very strikingly, in 2014 when he provoked the Euromaidan revolution. Now we're seeing the same thing in Georgia with his proxies trying to initially introduce authoritarian laws whilst claiming to be in favor of European integration, then fairly openly rigging an election in their favor, which is what we saw in late October. A very widespread electoral fraud was carried out and accompanied by intimidation and violence. That caused great unease amongst the Georgian people. And now I think the last straw is for the authorities to come out and say, officially, we are abandoning the course of European integration. Everybody understands that means we are going back to Moscow. Now, what we're seeing is, I think, a very organic response to that on the streets of Tbilisi and other Georgian cities, much as we saw in Ukraine 10 years ago when Russia tried to employ the same tactics in Ukraine and force Ukraine to turn away from European integration. So it'll be very interesting to see how this plays out and whether the Georgian people will be able to withstand what is likely to be a very, very tough crackdown on them, on the protesters. Sadly, I fear we will see bloodshed. We will see rather increased bloodshed. There's already been violence against protesters. I fear that will escalate, and it will become a battle of wills, as these kind of uprisings do tend to evolve into. It will be a battle of wills between the Georgian people and the Kremlin-backed authorities.
The memories of 2014 are still very fresh in my memory, in my mind. I remember all those violence that I saw in Kiev when Viktor Yanukovych has adopted the dragon laws, the so-called dragon laws, a set of authoritarian measures even more harsh than the laws that are currently adopted in Georgia, and that caused the real violent start outbreak after the first several clashes with the protesters. And Putin is acting like that. He hasn't got whole countries, whole former realms of Russian Empire. He's got part of Georgia, part of Ukraine, part of Moldova. Unfortunately, he got the entirety of Belarus right now in some hybrid form. But still, in 2008, there was an invasion of Georgia, a war, a Russian-Georgian war, the second Russian-Georgian war. And I believe that people remember that. Those who were kids in 2008 are grown-up adults, 30-year-old people right now in Tbilisi. And I really hope that people will have the chance to withstand all that aggression and there will be no bloodshed.
Well, of course, that would be the hope for everybody, but I think it's unrealistic at this stage. We know how Russia operates. We know that Russia will fight back, that Russia will push its proxies in Georgia to fight and will tell them, do this, take extreme action. We saw the same pressure applied in 2004 to the Ukrainian government. Then the Ukrainian government ultimately said, no, we will not use troops against our own people. And the Orange Revolution was a success. In 2014, the Russians very openly called on Yanukovych to crush the protests, to use violence against protesters. And he did so. And we saw a large number, tragically, of people murdered in the center of Kiev. We saw the Maidan protesters gunned down. We saw protesters prior to the mass killings of February 2014. We saw escalating violence where protesters were picked off the streets individually, were taken away, were tortured, were murdered as part of the Kremlin's or part of the Ukrainian government backed by the Kremlin crackdown on these protests. So I think it's very, very unlikely that the current regime in Georgia would somehow just back down and say, oh, well, we recognize that the people are against what we want. They're going to go all the way. They're going to push it further. We will see an escalation in the violence, and that is likely to become a key feature in the next few days and perhaps weeks. So This pattern is well established, and I think we all know there's a sense of foreboding, of dread that this is where this is heading now, but also a sense that there is really very little alternative if Georgia is to remain free, if Georgia is to avoid being consumed by the Kremlin, being reintegrated at force as part of Russia's informal empire and losing its fundamental democratic rights. Never mind its European integration, its basic human rights. So this is a clash really that will define the future trajectory of Georgia and will have huge implications for the surrounding region.
Well, let's hope for the better, as the history teaches us that violence is always the last resort, and in revolutions or protests like this, it always leads to the worst outcomes for people. And the last question I'd like to ask you is the visit of Olaf Scholz to Kiev, the first visit since 2014, since summer, oh, I'm sorry, since 2022, since the summer of 2022. With a strange suitcase in his hand and an intention to talk with Zelensky. What is that gesture about, and what do you think they will talk about?
Well, Olaf Scholz is on the election campaign now. He has an election looming in early 2025. I mean, frankly, he's not a popular figure in Germany now. He's widely discredited. He's likely to lose the election. This is the expectation at the moment. One of the reasons why he is unpopular, or is rather discredited, is because of his response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. He's talked at times quite a good fight. He's talked about transforming Germany's geopolitics, Germany's position, and in fairness, he has achieved some significant successes. Germany's gone from a country that wouldn't dream of providing weapons to other European states under any circumstances, due to its very traumatic and troubling past in the 20th century under Adolf Hitler, of course. But he's managed to overcome a lot of the historic legacy of that period, and the very deeply embedded sense of German pacifism, that they should avoid any involvement in any military conflicts whatsoever, if possible. But still, his response has been inadequate. He's been too cautious, and in many ways he remains too cautious. He's known for not giving Ukraine the capability to strike back inside Russia with the Taurus missiles, of course. He's also quite outspoken in his opposition of Ukraine receiving a NATO membership invitation. He has spoken very cautiously about addressing Russia, and spoken about the need to avoid confrontation with a nuclear power, suggesting that he essentially recognizes Russia's right to use nuclear blackmail, that he in many ways reinforces the idea of Russia's nuclear blackmail, legitimizes these nuclear threats. So Scholz has a lot to prove in terms of his leadership on the international scene. So I think this is why we're seeing him arriving in Kiev, coming here to talk about German support for Ukraine. I'm sure that, of course, will be on top of the agenda. We've already heard news of a very significant arms package for Ukraine. Again, it's important to underline that Germany has provided Ukraine with a lot of military support. It's been one of the leading supporters of Ukraine. This should not be underestimated. We should not underestimate how much Germany has done. But at the same time, there is a sense that Scholz himself is a reluctant partner for Ukraine. He's a reluctant figure in the coalition of international supporters of Ukraine, of Western leaders backing Ukraine, and that is damaging for him in Germany. German opinion polls consistently show very high public support, growing public support for military aid to Ukraine. That is out of step with Scholz, who's a much more cautious figure, who tends to say, let's wait, let's not give this, let's not give that, let's stand back, let's make sure we don't provoke Russia. These are not the messages that people are expecting to hear in Germany now, or would like to hear. And there is a recognition, I think, amongst the German public that a hard, tough stance is needed to deal with the threat from Russia. And Scholz is not the man to do that. So I think by coming to Kiev, he's trying to challenge those perceptions of him. But ultimately, unless he acts accordingly, he's stuck with that reputation.
I also would like to praise our German partners, our German allies, for being great donors in air defense. Probably we can have this conversation because Germany donated several Patriot batteries and a lot of Iris-T modern air defense systems. We have light because of that electricity, because our thermal power plants in Kiev, several of them have survived Russian wow attacks because of German air defenses. Also, the military support with Leopard tanks and the incredible economic support for Ukrainian sustainable economy right now. We are very grateful to our German friends right now. Probably this visit of Olaf Scholz is more of a political move, as you say. They have already spoken with Zelensky about joint drone production. So we see all these cautious moments like drone production, air defenses, everything defensive and small, some small arms, small decisions, but nothing really major. So we're not talking about missiles, about the offensive potential, but still, Germany, the fourth economy in the world and the leader, a great leader in the European Union, we are very grateful for that.
Absolutely. No, I would not underestimate Germany's contribution. I think we need to be clear that they have been a major supporter. They have donated a huge amount of military support. You're right to highlight air defenses. Germany has been the leader on air defenses. It's been instrumental in other categories. But again, this is a major global economy. This is a major industrial state nation. This is the leader of the European Union in almost every sense. So we would hope for it to play that role. And again, this is really about the leadership and the position, the personal position of Olaf Scholz in Germany's support for Ukraine. He is not yet convinced people that he is fully committed to Ukraine, and certainly not to a Ukrainian victory. And there is a sense, I believe, a sense in Germany itself, they need someone more resolute, more decisive, who's able to stand up to Vladimir Putin in ways that Scholz is perhaps not equipped to do. He's simply not that kind of politician. He's not the right man in the right place. Of course, it's very welcome that he will continue his support for Ukraine and that he's come to Kiev to show his support. But I fear it's probably a case of too little too late for him personally.
Well, we will see what happens in Germany after the elections and who will take the lead in the Bundestag of the German Federal Republic. Thank you very much, Mr. Dickinson, for this interview. It was a pleasure to talk to you, as always, and have a nice evening. That will be all for today. It was Pavlo Shtermach. We are UATV English, doing our best to deliver hard truths in easy terms for the whole free world directly from Ukraine. Please like, share and comment, because your voice matters, as it helps Ukrainian voice to be heard globally. Stay safe and tuned for more news already tomorrow with me again. Goodbye.